your average UFC fan here once again, and today I would like to debate the overratedness of Nick Diaz, the UFC fighter. I suppose we can still call him a UFC fighter. He was technically suspended. I don't think he's suspended anymore. Actually, he isn't suspended anymore. He's eligible to fight. He was suspended for 5 years at one point. He ended up getting that overturned to 2.5, and he hasn't fought since 2015. Prior to that, he didn't do very well in the UFC, as we all know. Anybody who followed Diaz know. But he's still been offered huge fights, which I will explain. And I'll explain why I think he's overrated. His overall MMA record is 26-9-2, the two being no contests overturned due to one guy, Anderson Silva, being caught for steroids, him being caught for smoking weed at the same time, and another one for him being caught smoking weed, which led to a 5-year suspension, which he had overturned. He fights at a Cesar Gracie's fight team. Great fight team. Nate Diaz fights out of there. Also other big names. Can't really think of any off the top of my head right now, but Jake Shields, another big name. He's 35 years old. He hasn't fought since 2015, so his prime is passing him slowly, but apparently he still thinks he's one of the best. And his UFC record, 6-6-1. So he's not even 500 technically. He is 500, but he has the one no contest where he lost. He lost that fight. That was to Anderson Silva. His biggest UFC wins are over a washed-up BJ Penn. BJ Penn way past his prime after he lost George St. Pierre, after he lost his UFC title, his lightweight UFC title. A prime Robbie Lawler, but not the Robbie Lawler who came back at welterweight and dominated everybody. Robbie Lawler, pre that, I think it was UFC 45. After that, Robbie Lawler went to American Top Team, went outside the UFC, had a bunch of big wins, won in Strikeforce, went down to be UFC welterweight champion, way better fighter than Nick Diaz could ever hope to be. And his other win is Gleison Tebow, TKO, his other big UFC win. He has a couple other UFC wins over Josh Neer and a couple other guys. Can't really think of them off the top of my head. I think Jeremy Jackson, he fought Jeremy Jackson and beat Jeremy Jackson in UFC as well. That was a really good fight. Diaz is a really good fighter, very entertaining fighter. I love watching him fight. I would pay to watch him fight for sure, but I don't think he deserves the fights he's gotten outside of the UFC. He has a great record. He was the Strikeforce champion. I'll list off some of his accolades and stuff, but some of the titles he won outside the UFC. He won the IFC champion. He was the IFC welterweight champion. He defeated Jeremy Jackson. He was the WEC welterweight champion. He defeated Joe Hurley. Joe Hurley's a really good fighter. Not a big name, but if you ever watch Joe Hurley fight, he can go for sure. So was Jeremy Jackson, but he fucked up a lot. He was on the Ultimate Fighter as well, Jeremy Jackson was. He's a good fighter for sure. He got some big wins. And he defeated Chris Lytle for the IFC title. This is pre-UFC Lytle now, pre-Ultimate Fighter Lytle, the guy who fought Sarah and went down and had some big wins. The fucking Ultimate Fighter, like, Chris Lytle's awesome. I love Chris Lytle. He's a true fighter to his core, and when he retired, he went that well. I heard he's into politics now. He was a volunteer fighter. Just a great person overall, and for Diaz to have that name on his resume, a win over him, big win no matter when it was, and he beat him for a title in the IFC. That's saying something right there. So that's a big win for Diaz outside the UFC. Undisputed, he is a really good fighter. When he's fighting lower tier fighters, not even lower tier fighters, but just guys that wouldn't be top 10 currently in the UFC, or at the time when he was fighting in the UFC, he does really well. But he has never beat a number one contender in the UFC, ever. He's fought two and he hasn't beat him, and he's never won a title in the UFC. This is why I think he's super overrated. As a UFC fighter, he's super overrated. Some of the fights he gets offered, he doesn't deserve. Fans can say, oh, he's great, he's a Diaz. A lot of what he gets is from talking and just being a dick, like having his own style. A lot of people like his attitude, how he doesn't give a fuck, middle fingers up to the UFC, treat Dana White like and all them like their shit. But that's just the Diaz style. Nate isn't much different. But Nate Diaz isn't overrated by no means. Nate Diaz has a way better UFC record and way bigger wins under his belt. He was the Strikeforce champion. He defeated Marius Zaromakis. I've never seen that fight personally. I've seen a lot of his Strikeforce fights, like the Paul Daly one, the Cyborg one, the male Cyborg one. But I've never seen him when he won the title, but that's who he beat for the title. Was a dominant Strikeforce champ. Beat Paul Daly, the male Cyborg, a couple other big names. He fought KJ Noons outside Strikeforce. He lost him. He beat Frank Shamrock in Strikeforce. His biggest wins outside the UFC were Paul Daly, Chris Lytle, and Frank Shamrock, just to get that out of the way. His biggest losses in the UFC, GSP, Condit, Silva, but that ended up being turned to a no contest because Silva got caught for steroids, Diaz got caught for weed. I don't know, Diaz, even though he lost that fight, that should just been scrubbed off his resume. I don't even know, because he didn't take steroids. If anything, Anderson Silva should have had more punishment for that, because he took steroids, and all Diaz did was smoke weed. So like, Silva was clearly at a great advantage, and Silva won every round in that fight. Once again, Nick Diaz made excuses for it, but he did. If he had known Silva was on steroids, he would have had a really good excuse. But he made a lot of other excuses, trying to say he won the rounds when he didn't. And he lost to Sean Shirk back in the day, way back in the day, UFC 65, if I'm not mistaken, 62 maybe. He was on the go for years. Diaz has been fighting for years and years. He got at least 16, 17 years of professional fighting under his belt. All of his fights outside of the UFC are great, even his losses. He is a very entertaining fighter. I just want to stress, I can't stress this enough. I'm not saying he's not an entertaining fighter. He's not a good fighter. He's just overrated. He isn't a top 5 fighter in the welterweight division UFC, and he never should have been. And I'm going to tell you why right now. Because he's 6-6 in the UFC. He's lost all of his title fights. His last four UFC fights. He lost to Silva by no contest. He lost to GSP in a title fight. He lost to Condit in an interim title fight. And he lost... No, yeah, that's all the fights he lost. He was supposed to fight GSP when he first came into the UFC, when he came over from Strikeforce. He ended up pulling no show at the press conference. So instead of giving him GSP, they said, you know what, we're taking that title fight from you. We'll give you a washed up old BJ Penn. Just after losing his lightweight title and a couple other fights, he wasn't a BJ Penn he was before, and he was a lightweight stepping up to welterweight. Diaz dominated all 3 rounds, still couldn't finish him, won by decision. That was his last one in the UFC almost 7 or 8 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. And after that, he lost to Condit, he lost to GSP, and he lost to Silva. 3 straight UFC losses in a row. And this is why I'm calling him overrated, because he recently, as last year, got offered a title fight against Tyron Woodley over Colby Covington, over Kamaru Usman, over Darren Till, over all these red-hot, undefeated, young, prime fighters. And old Diaz, with 3 straight losses under his belt, hasn't fought in 4 years, gets offered a fucking UFC title fight. I know talking and being popular and being a draw gets you fights, but he does not deserve that. If he had to get that fight, how it would get ratings, how people would want to see it is beyond me. Tyron Woodley would fucking wreck him right now. Would wreck him. Tyron Woodley's a beast. We've seen what he did to Darren Till. He's a little bit boring in his other fights. We've seen what he did in the first Wonder Boy fight. Tyron Woodley is not someone you want to fuck with, especially coming off a 4-year layoff, being overrated as you are, and not having the style to beat him at all. Tyron Woodley would destroy him. And he also got offered a fight against Robbie Lawler, which I think would have been a good fight. I think Diaz could give him a go for sure, just with the toughness Diaz has and the pace he has, but he hasn't beaten Robbie Lawler. Because Robbie Lawler is a guy, you got to knock him out. You got to freight train knock him out like Tyron Woodley did to finish him. And Diaz has never been known for that power. He isn't getting a submission on Robbie Lawler. If other big names couldn't get a submission on Robbie Lawler, other big fighters couldn't do it, Diaz ain't doing it. I'm sorry, it's just not happening in my opinion. I heard he was offered some big 185 fights too. Can't really think of the names off the top of my head. But the fact that he was offered a top 5 guy like Robbie Lawler and a title fight within the past year, and he turned both of them down, claiming it was for the money. This guy's supposed to be a fighter, hasn't fought in years. Always on TMZ, always online bitching about how he should be fighting this guy, how he should be getting this fight, how he should be getting more respect. Every time he loses, he makes excuses. I've never seen Nick Diaz lose in a good way where he doesn't have 100 excuses, even if he's humble immediately after the fight. By the time they get to the post-fight press conference and everybody's talking, Diaz has a fucking jot notebook full of excuses. It's insane. And some of the things he says are ridiculous. Going into his fights, he'll praise his training camp. He'll praise Cesar Gracie fight team. He'll talk about how good the camp went, how great he's feeling, how he's doing triathlons. Then he'll lose and he'll say, oh, he didn't do this in camp. Oh, training camp wasn't good. He didn't have the right sparring partners. He has said these things. You go watch any Nick Diaz press conference, post-fight press conference. He mumbles a lot of it. He is incoherent sometimes when he speaks. I guess he's a bit punch drunk throughout the years, but he does say a lot of disrespectful stuff as a teammate. I would be so pissed off to hear that. Basically putting his training partners and his team under the bus for some of his losses, and I really don't find it cool at all. The GSP one in particular, he completely threw his team under the bus in that, but no one seemed to speak about it. But yeah, that's some of my reasons why Nate Diaz is super overrated. Some notes on him: he was suspended for smoking weed twice. One led to a 5-year suspension that he got overturned into a 2.5-year suspension. He was fined $250,000. He hasn't fought since 2015. He's been offered giant fights. He lost title shot due to not showing up media day. 4 straight losses in the UFC, being offered title fights, and hasn't fought in 4 years. If that isn't overrated, I don't know what is. That is ridiculous. Adrian Broner in boxing with 3 straight losses getting offered a title fight against Pacquiao or defending, whatever it is. He deserved that more than Diaz, and I thought that was ridiculous. He makes excuses for every loss. That was the last note I had written, highlighted, boom, boom, exclamation marks, because that's just Nick Diaz for you. I don't hate the guy as a fighter. He is a great fighter, a very entertaining fighter. No matter who he fights, I'd love to see him fight. But he isn't beating a top 5 UFC contender. Not at welterweight. Darren Till would fucking smoke him. Kamaru Usman would smoke him. Colby Covington would have his way with him. Tyron Woodley would have his way with him. Stephen Thompson would KO him. He has zero chance of ever doing anything big in the UFC again besides entertaining fights that are going to be big draws, like if he fought Cowboy Cerrone or something like that. Those are the only chance he has of doing anything, and I don't think he'd win that fight even. And that's not a knock against Diaz or Cowboy or nothing like that. They're both a bit old. It would be an entertaining fight. If Nate Diaz can beat Cowboy, maybe Nick can, but not off a 4-year layoff. And he doesn't deserve the accolades. He doesn't deserve the props he gets. He's still somehow relevant in the MMA world. You still see him on interviews and Ariel Helwani, and I think it's because Nate's so popular, especially after the Conor fight. Nick was around a lot for that. So yeah, and he's always controversial with Dana White. Him and Dana White clearly don't like each other, no matter how much Dana says, oh, I don't hate the Diazes, they're just different. Now this, you can tell Dana White definitely doesn't like the Diazes. Nate's turned down some big fights too. They're claiming court cases, they're claiming suspension, they're claiming every reason other than they don't want to fight. Claiming money. But I don't know what it is. Doesn't seem like the guys want to fight to me. It seemed like the Diaz brothers just want to be on Instagram posting memes. I'm not saying nothing bad about Nate. I'm just saying he hasn't fought since the Conor fight, and he no-showed for the Dustin Poirier fight. I heard Poirier got injured, so if I'm mistaken on that, my bad. But he was supposed to fight Poirier, and for all I know, Diaz is the reason why that fight isn't happening, especially how he walked at the press conference. But yeah, Nick Diaz, super overrated. One of the most overrated UFC fighters in the world ever, and currently the most overrated, inactive, old UFC fighter. Just my opinion. Agree or disagree, feel free to leave a like or a comment. Don't forget to subscribe to the page for a lot more UFC talk. Plenty more to come, guys who I think are great, guys who I think are overrated, top 10s, what's happening recently in UFC, and plenty of other sports talk. This is Mr. Average UFC Fan, over and out. Have a good day, folks.